In this week's AMT Insight, I'm going to talk about resource nationalism, why it's something that's on the rise, and also the implications for metal markets. So firstly, what is resource nationalism? Well, really it's the tendency of governments and societies to try and seek greater control or revenue from the natural resources in their territory. Now, why is that something that's on the rise? Well, there's a few different drivers for this, really. All have been affected and exacerbated in different ways by the pandemic and the outcome of the pandemic. But the first is economic. So really, the pandemic has had a big impact on the finances and the economies of many developing countries around the world. And at the same time, you've seen commodity prices obviously booming in the bull market that we've seen. And the mining companies that are producing those commodities, their valuations have been going through the roof. But many of those mining companies are extracting those commodities from countries which have been suffering quite hard. So there's naturally a tendency in these mineral-rich economies to say, hey, we need some extra revenue to support our rebound from the pandemic, to fix our finances. The mining companies have been doing quite well, so why can't they contribute a bit more? Now, in terms of nationalistic tendencies and drivers, there's a tendency in the last few years in terms of a rejection of globalization and a rise of populism in politics. And that's something we've kind of seen in South America over the last year or so as well, in terms of civil unrest with the wealth divide and also politicians using kind of the entitlement that people have there over the natural resources of those countries and their importance to economies, and combined with the rejection of free trade principles amongst populations to build these policies and stand on these platforms that reflect these kind of increased resource nationalism policies. Now, in terms of the strategic drivers for increased resource nationalism, well, the US, the EU, China, all major consumers have all made these big commitments to a long-term decarbonization of their economies, and it's going to require huge amounts of investment and in terms of infrastructure and the transition to electric vehicles, and all that's going to require metals, and there's going to be huge competition for those metals, and that's going to be made worse by the tensions we've seen between China and Western economies and trade tensions and frictions that have emerged as a result of that. That means that the countries that have these resources, these mineral-rich economies, they're going to be emboldened and have the power really to extract these financial and political concessions from these consumers that need that metal so much. There's some strategic drivers there for some changes as well. Now, where you see maybe the resource nationalism becoming more of an issue is countries where the mineral output is a bigger share of the economy, right? So I picked out some countries here that have been in the news recently in terms of this theme, and you can see mostly they're countries in Africa, South America, and then Indonesia the last few years has displayed some policies as well. Now, in terms of what the measures are that these countries are being implementing to try and get this increased revenue control over their natural resources. So firstly, it's taxation, so taxes and royalties are on the mining output of those countries. So you've seen Chile trying to put a bill through to increase mining royalties. You've seen Peru also, the presidential candidate, calling for increased contribution from mining companies. In the DRC and Zambia, you've also seen in the last few years, super profits in the DRC, super taxes on profits, and in Zambia they're trying to renegotiate the mining contracts and bills with companies as well. So the second measure really is state ownership, whether that's through expropriation or through a contract renegotiations. And for example, would be in Chile, where you've got a communist candidate for the upcoming presidential elections in November, who's calling for state ownership and share of all mining operations in the country. So these are the kind of themes and actions and policies that we're likely to see. And thirdly, you've got trade barriers. So there's been a trend in recent years, led by Indonesia, I would say, to try and move down the value chain in terms of their raw materials. So Indonesia, you've seen it with the ore bans, over the last few years, and most recently that was nickel, beginning of 2020, and they've been quite successful in building up their further down the supply chain, their industries further down the supply chain, and processing the minerals in the country. So that's something that other countries might try and emulate. Also, you've seen probably resource nationalism, maybe not in the traditional sense, but in terms of recycling and scrap supply, it might be something where countries start to see that a bit more as a resource in the future. And in Europe, they're reviewing the scrap export policy at the moment, and part of the aim of that is to achieve greater recycling within the EU itself. So there's other areas which maybe in some ways can constitute a resource nationalism, control over resources in the country. So what are the overall implications? Well, I think the clearest implication is that anywhere where you're increasing the revenue or making it more difficult to operate because you're requiring state ownership of mines, for example, you're likely to see a reduction in project investment and a reduction in the attraction of investors going to those countries to invest in the future. In terms of trying to bring more manufacturing into the country rather than exporting ore, so bans on ore, for example, like we saw in Indonesia, I think these barriers to trade over time, they're an increase in trade friction and a reduction in free market economics. So overall, you might expect costs overall globally to net increase in costs because of those additional frictions. But thirdly, I'd say also that because of this increased focus on security of supply in the coming years, particularly amongst these countries that are so desperate for these metals, you might see this increase in resource nationalism, if it comes to be the case, result in greater incentives to invest in recycling capacity in major economies, and also in mine projects that might not be as attractive economically, but they're in more politically stable regions, and they're more for the environment, and maybe perhaps more environmentally sustainable as well. So that's kind of the overview on resource nationalism. Thanks again for listening this week to this week's commentary, and please subscribe to our LinkedIn channel and YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. Thank you.